Even the world's most loved Beatle had people who didn't like him. Paul McCartney is known for being nice and making great music, but he didn't always get along with other musicians. Behind the scenes, fights, disagreements about music, and personal anger shaped his friendships in the music business. Here are the top 5 musicians McCartney openly or secretly disliked the most. The Beatles are often called the band that changed everything. They were so important that almost every big group that came after them copied some of their sound, their way of doing things, or their ideas. For many years, musicians both loved and struggled with that heavy influence. One band that copied the Beatles a lot was Oasis, the loud Manchester band that took over the Brit pop scene in the 1990s, with attitude, rough guitars, and songs that filled big arenas. Their songs sounded like Lennon-McCartney harmonies. Their look copied the 1960s, and they wanted to be huge with no limits. Since Oasis openly loved the Beatles, it might have made sense that Paul McCartney would see them as good followers, or at least like their tribute. But for years, the opposite happened. Instead of liking them, McCartney said mean things about them, not because of their music style, but because of the band's know-it-all attitude. For him, Oasis showed something that bothered many people. They acted like they deserved everything without being humble. The fight that started McCartney's dislike happened in 1996. When Britpop was really popular, Noel Gallagher, the band's loud guitarist and main songwriter, said something that would hurt them for many years. In an interview with MTV, Gallagher boldly said that Oasis's first 2 albums, Definitely Maybe from 1994 and What's the Story Morning Glory from 1995, made them better than the Beatles. It was a statement full of bragging, but also one that crossed a special line. For many people, the Beatles weren't just another band. They were the best example of modern music. To easily say you're better than them seemed both silly and rude. Years later, Gallagher would admit that he was high on drugs when he said that, suggesting it was more careless than on purpose. But by then, the damage was done. The comments spread everywhere, making Oasis look like arrogant new kids who believed they could beat the very stars they copied. Paul McCartney, not surprisingly, did not like the comparison. In 1997, he stopped being quiet and talked about Oasis directly with words that really hurt. They're derivative, and they think too much of themselves. They mean nothing to me. Coming from McCartney, a man who rarely attacked other musicians, this was really harsh. His choice of the word derivative was terrible, especially for a band whose whole sound was built on borrowing and changing parts of the Beatles' style. To McCartney, Oasis were not creators. They were copiers, made bigger by their own publicity. By 2001, McCartney became a little nicer, explaining his thoughts during an interview with Howard Stern. He said that his first feelings toward Oasis had actually been good. He liked their energy, their songwriting, and their potential. But Noel Gallagher's crazy claim ruined that good feeling. "I've just said they are slightly derivative," McCartney admitted. "I didn't badmouth them that much." His words suggested that deep down he respected Oasis's music, but couldn't ignore the arrogance that covered it. For McCartney, the problem wasn't only that Oasis borrowed from the Beatles. Lots of bands had done that before. The issue was that Oasis, rather than admitting the debt with humility, seemed to enjoy it while at the same time bragging they could beat their heroes. It was a contradiction that sounded fake, and McCartney had no patience for it. Time, however, has a way of making rivalries softer. By the 2010s, Oasis was long broken up. Their reign was a memory carried by fans of the Brit pop era. The band's crazy history, marked by brother fights, legendary concerts, and a huge explosion, had turned them into cult figures. McCartney, with the view of age and experience, looked back with less anger. In a 2016 interview with GQ, he admitted that Oasis had been young, fresh, and writing good tunes. He even praised their early music, admitting the excitement they brought to the music scene. Yet he couldn't help pointing to their big mistake. "I thought the biggest mistake they made was when they said, "We're going to be bigger than the Beatles." I thought, so many people have said that, and it's the kiss of death. McCartney's comment showed not only his view on Oasis, but also his understanding of music history. Many bands had tried to beat the Beatles, whether in ambition, sales, or cultural impact, and almost all had failed. Claiming to be bigger than the Beatles wasn't just arrogant. It invited making fun of them and pressure that no group could survive. For Oasis, that claim became a burden they could never get rid of. When the world thinks of Paul McCartney, the picture that usually comes to mind is that of the charming, friendly former Beatle. Interviews show him as nice, thoughtful, and full of warmth. A man who seems more likely to laugh with the press than fight with them. But as anyone who has studied his career closely knows, that public image hides a deeply competitive spirit. McCartney, like his late songwriting partner John Lennon, is driven by a desire to be the best, to leave a mark, and to make sure that his work stands above the rest. This drive does not pick favorites. It reaches beyond rival musicians and even onto those who are close to him, including long-term friends and peers from London's own rock royalty. In 2021, McCartney caused international headlines with comments about the Rolling Stones that seemed to walk the line between admiration and criticism. While discussing the legacy of the Fab Four compared to the iconic painted black outfit, he made a comment that many saw as not-so-subtle put-down. "I'm not sure I should say it, but the Rolling Stones are a blues cover band. That's sort of what the Stones are," he said. "I think our net was cast a bit wider than theirs." The words, delivered in McCartney's typically measured tone, still caused a big fuss. Fans, critics, and the media picked apart his statement, debating whether it showed insecurity, playful teasing, or an honest reflection of musical reality. Yet for those familiar with McCartney's personality, this wasn't totally unexpected. He has long been unafraid to voice opinions that others might keep private. In fact, this was not the first time he had compared the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, though it was the first time that got widespread attention. Speaking to Howard Stern in 2020, McCartney explained the comparison in a more detailed way. "The Stones are a fantastic group," he admitted. "They are rooted in the blues. When they are writing stuff, it has to do with the blues, whereas we had a little more influences. There's a lot of differences. And I love the Stones, but the Beatles were better." Here, the difference McCartney draws is subtle, but important. He is not dismissing the Rolling Stones. They are, after all, one of the most influential rock bands in history. But he emphasizes that the Beatles' strength was in diversity and experimentation. The Fab Four drew from many sources: classical music, Indian instruments, avant-garde techniques, folk, and even electronic experimentation. The Rolling Stones, brilliant as they are, were firmly rooted in the blues, and their genius showed mostly through their live performances, stagecraft, and stadium energy. For McCartney, comparing breadth of influence and studio innovation is not an insult. It is an observation about artistic scope. Interestingly, McCartney's comments sparked no public anger from the Stones themselves. Mick Jagger, the band's charismatic frontman, showed his typical grace in response. Rather than starting a feud, Jagger said that there was obviously no competition between the two groups. He even extended a gesture of friendship, inviting McCartney to work together on a track for the Rolling Stones' 2023 album Hackney Diamonds. Speaking to Zane Lowe, Jagger pointed out that while the Rolling Stones rule the stadium stage with their larger-than-life presence, the Beatles' genius is found in the studio. In other words, the two bands excelled in different areas rather than in direct rivalry. This difference reflects an important truth about the relationship between McCartney and the Stones. For decades, the band's fortunes, styles, and personalities have been compared in the public imagination. The Beatles as the experimental, carefully crafted studio architects, the Stones as the raw, powerful masters of blues-driven rock and stadium spectacle. McCartney, fiercely proud of the Beatles' innovation, naturally emphasized these differences when asked to compare. His competitive streak, long evident in comments about other artists like Madonna, Oasis, even Michael Jackson, extends here as well, though tempered by decades of reflection, friendship, and respect. The fact that McCartney can simultaneously critique and admire the Stones shows a broader pattern in his career. He does not shy away from honesty, even when it risks controversy. Whether discussing other icons or longtime peers, his comments are rarely rooted in meanness. They are an extension of his constant drive to measure, evaluate, and understand his place in the musical hierarchy. In that sense, his remarks about the Stones are as much a statement about himself and the Beatles' legacy as they are about Mick Jagger or Keith Richards. Moreover, McCartney's perspective reminds us that musical greatness has many sides. The Stones and the Beatles are often set against each other in conversations about the greatest rock bands of all time. But the truth is that each defined their own area. The Beatles reshaped studio recording, songwriting, and pop music as a compositional art. The Stones redefined live rock performance, charisma, and the raw power of the blues. McCartney's comments, while sensationalized in media headlines, are ultimately a celebration of difference rather than a critique of skill. When it comes to public rivalries in music, few would think to put Paul McCartney and Madonna in the same sentence. McCartney, one of the greatest songwriters of the 20th century, carved his legacy as a Beatle, a member of Wings, and a solo artist who defined melodic pop. Madonna, on the other hand, emerged in the 1980s as the Queen of Pop, a figure who thrived on controversy, reinvention, and spectacle. They represented different worlds. McCartney, the classic rock aristocrat, and Madonna, the fearless provocateur, who pushed boundaries of gender, religion, and sexuality. Yet despite those contrasts, McCartney admitted in rare moments of honesty that he carried a deep resentment toward Madonna's success. The revelation came in the 2015 book Conversations with McCartney, where the former Beatle opened up about his insecurities in ways fans weren't used to hearing. Though McCartney was usually diplomatic when speaking about his peers, when the subject turned to Madonna, he didn't hold back. He confessed that he often found her overwhelming popularity difficult to stomach. It wasn't that he disliked her music or her as a person. It was the cultural phenomenon surrounding her that ate at him. "She's treated like a goddess," McCartney complained. The words carried a mixture of sarcasm and envy. He explained that when people saw Madonna on television or in the press, they elevated her to a divine status, as though she were above ordinary humanity. "It makes me realize how people are affected by media," he said. "While you're looking at her from your little lowly room on your little telly, you think she's a goddess. You give her all of that. She doesn't even ask for it." That sense of frustration, McCartney admitted, wasn't just about Madonna. It was about the way fame works. Still, he singled her out as an example of how the public builds myths around certain figures. Once she's on tour, she's selling out 30,000. "She's a goddess. Look at the clothes she wears. No wonder. It's because she's better than us. We are only mortal. We've got tellies, and I bet she never sits and watches telly. When you get out on tour, you're a fellow god." His words painted a picture of the rock star's internal struggle, knowing he himself had once been worshipped on the same level as Madonna, but now forced to compete with a new generation of idols. To some, McCartney's comments might have sounded surprisingly bitter, even mean. After all, he had little reason to feel threatened by Madonna. Their music didn't compete directly. His legacy was cemented in the canon of classic rock, while hers dominated the pop charts and MTV screens. But McCartney explained the truth behind his resentment. Jealousy. He admitted that during the early 1990s, he viewed figures like Madonna and Michael Jackson as rivals. Even though his fame came from another era, he still kept an eye on the charts, measuring his own relevance against theirs. "The last tour in the 90s, it was Madonna I was worried about," he confessed. "If you're in any way competitive, it's what you do. You look at the charts, see what they've sold. Well, Let's try and sell some more. It's just life. This honesty revealed something essential about McCartney. For all his calm and friendly public image, he remained competitive, still chasing the kind of dominance he had enjoyed in the 1960s. Watching Madonna dominate the pop world, reinvent herself album after album and fill arenas across the globe left him uneasy. She represented everything he was trying to keep up with: youth, innovation, and cultural centrality. Madonna, for her part, likely never lost sleep over McCartney's remarks. She built her career on boldness, audacity, and a refusal to care about her critics. It's what allowed her to survive scandals, reinvent herself through countless eras, and hold on to her crown as pop royalty long after others faded. In fact, Madonna wasn't even a great fan of the Beatles to begin with. While the Fab Four were reshaping rock music in the 1960s, she gravitated more toward Motown, admiring artists like Diana Ross and Marvin Gaye. To her, the Beatles weren't sacred. They were simply another act in the vast history of music. That difference in perspective perhaps made McCartney's jealousy sting even more. Here was a woman who didn't even revere his band, yet she managed to achieve the same kind of godlike fame he once had. To fans of both artists, the irony is striking. McCartney, the man whose band practically invented modern celebrity culture, felt dwarfed by someone who mastered that culture in a completely different way. Few musicians can claim a life so deeply connected with the Beatles as Phil Collins. From his earliest days in London, the Liverpool Quartet served as both inspiration and obsession. As a young boy, Collins would eat up their records, soaking in the melodies, harmonies, and creative songwriting that would later shape his own musical senses. His admiration was so intense that as a teenager, he even appeared as an extra in A Hard Day's Night, one of the Beatles' first movies. A small role, perhaps, but a memory that anchored his connection to the band. Collins' relationship with the Beatles only deepened as his career developed. He had the rare privilege of working alongside George Harrison during the sessions for Harrison's 1970 solo masterpiece, All Things Must Pass. That collaboration was not merely professional. It represented a dream realized for a young man whose musical path had been shaped by the Beatles' sound. Yet even in this golden chapter, Collins experienced the sting of exclusion. He was left out of portions of All Things Must Pass, a decision that haunted him for years. It was a subtle reminder that being close to greatness does not always guarantee recognition. If being left out of Harrison's landmark album was painful, what happened years later at Buckingham Palace would leave an even more lasting mark on Collins's memory. By 2002, Collins had become a global star in his own right, commanding respect and admiration across genres. One would assume that an encounter with Paul McCartney, a man who symbolized the peak of musical achievement, would be celebratory, or at least cordial. Unfortunately, the reality was far from that. Collins recounted the incident in a 2016 interview with the Sunday Times, his voice tinged with lingering frustration. "I met him when I was working at the Buckingham Palace party back in 2002, he said. The venue, steeped in royal tradition, was hardly the most rock and roll environment imaginable. Yet it provided the stage for an interaction that would leave him seething. Collins had brought along a first edition of The Beatles by Hunter Davies, hoping to get McCartney's autograph. He approached the Beatle with the expectation of a warm, mutual acknowledgement. Instead, he was met with a comment that cut deeply. McCartney came up with Heather Mills, and I had a first edition of The Beatles by Hunter Davies, and I said, 'Hey, Paul, do you mind signing this for me?' And he said, 'Oh, Heather, our little Phil's a bit of a Beatles fan.' And I thought, you fuck. You fuck." Never forgot it. Collins's choice of words underscores the rawness of the moment. For someone who had devoted a lifetime to music and who had paid homage to the Beatles at every turn, the remark felt belittling, almost treating him like a child. McCartney's tone, according to Collins, carried a subtle condescension that made the slight worse. He has this thing when he's talking to you where he makes you feel like, I know this must be hard for you because I'm a Beatle. I'm Paul McCartney. And it must be very hard for you to actually be holding a conversation with me. The encounter, set in one of the most formal and prestigious spaces in the United Kingdom, left Collins feeling diminished, a sensation out of place with his accomplishments. The story did not remain private for long. Word of Collins's displeasure inevitably reached McCartney. In true Beatle fashion, he did not engage in a drawn-out confrontation or public debate. Instead, the former Beatle reached out, not with a formal apology, but with a practical message, encouraging both parties to move past the incident. It was a gesture of closure rather than reconciliation, a recognition that some slights, whether intended or not, might best be acknowledged and then left behind. Yet Collins, despite his measured approach to the music industry, felt compelled to discuss the episode publicly. In a 2016 interview with Billboard, he reflected on the incident with a mix of regret and resolve. While he expressed remorse if his words caused McCartney any offense, he insisted that speaking out was necessary. Without acknowledgement, he argued the behavior would remain unexamined and unchanged. In other words, silence would only continue the problem, whereas speaking up offered the possibility, however small, of accountability. This interaction between two giants of the music world highlights the complicated dynamics of admiration, legacy, and ego. Collins's life has been profoundly shaped by the Beatles. He was inspired by them, walked on their sets, and collaborated with them at the height of his career. Yet, even those closest to the Fab Four are not immune to the psychological and emotional complexities that arise from being close to icons. McCartney, whose competitive nature is well documented, may not have intended cruelty. His comment could have been a throwaway line, an attempt at humor, or a manifestation of his own insecurities. But for Collins, the effect was undeniable, a stark reminder that brilliance often casts shadows, and even those who stand in the sun may feel its glare. Few stories in pop history show the collision of genius, ambition, and betrayal quite like the relationship between Paul McCartney and Michael Jackson. On the surface, the pairing seemed perfect. McCartney, the seasoned Beatle and masterful songwriter, had decades of experience in crafting enduring hits. Jackson, the global pop phenomenon, was already at the height of his fame, a figure whose voice and charisma transcended borders. Together, they could do no wrong, or so it seemed. Their connection began in the late 1970s, when Jackson recorded a cover of Wings' Girlfriend for his 1979 landmark album, Off the Wall. McCartney, intrigued and flattered by Jackson's enthusiasm for his music, responded warmly. This mutual admiration laid the groundwork for one of pop music's most famous collaborations, 1982's Thriller, on which they duetted on the track The Girl Is Mine. The song, a playful and romantic back and forth, showcased their vocal chemistry and suggested a friendship built not just on music, but on mutual respect. The partnership extended into McCartney's solo work. In 1983, they recorded Say, Say, Say and The Man for McCartney's Pipes of Peace album. At first glance, the collaboration seemed seamless. Two of the biggest names in music working together to create tracks that would dominate charts and radio airplay. But beneath the polished production and catchy melodies, tensions were quietly simmering. According to reports, the partnership began to sour during the recording sessions for Say, Say, Say. McCartney, who had long been a vocal advocate for the rights of songwriters, advised Jackson to invest his immense fortune into music publishing. McCartney understood the power of owning one's compositions. He had himself experienced the highs and lows of music rights after the Beatles split. He assumed Jackson, with his unprecedented success, would heed the advice. Unfortunately for McCartney, Jackson's ambition extended beyond collaboration. It extended into acquisition. The rupture came on August 14, 1985. In an audacious move that would forever change their relationship, Jackson purchased the publishing rights to the majority of the Beatles' back catalog from the parent company, ATV, for $47 million. To the untrained eye, this may have appeared to be a standard business transaction, but for McCartney, it was deeply personal. Since 1969, due to mismanagement of his and Lennon's publishing company, Northern Songs, McCartney had not been receiving the royalties he was owed. That year, he had even contemplated a bid to reclaim control of the catalog to secure what was legally and emotionally his. But Jackson, wielding his position as the world's most famous entertainer, outmaneuvered him with ease. McCartney, despite his immense influence and experience, was left stunned and outraged. In interviews, McCartney did not shy away from expressing his frustration. "I think it's dodgy to do something like that," he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "To be someone's friend and then buy the rug they're standing on." The statement encapsulated not only the personal betrayal, but the sense of exploitation he felt. It was more than a business maneuver. It was a violation of trust, a demonstration that in the high-stakes world of music publishing, friendship could be subordinated to strategy and ambition. Jackson, for his part, remained mostly silent on the controversy at the time. Yet hints of acknowledgement emerged years later in his 1989 autobiography, Moonwalk, where he reflected on the lessons learned from the episode. "Paul and I both learned the hard way about business," Jackson wrote, noting the importance of publishing and royalties and the dignity of songwriting. His comments, measured and retrospective, seem to frame the acquisition less as a betrayal and more as a harsh, inevitable lesson in the music industry's brutal realities. What do you think about the musicians that Paul McCartney doesn't like? Leave us your comments in the section below. We hope you have found this helpful video. Don't forget to leave a like, share, and subscribe to the channel if you like it. Thank you for watching this, and see you in the next videos. Goodbye.